The relative quiet of a fragile ceasefire was shattered in the early hours of March 18, 2025. Israel launched a wave of airstrikes targeting the Gaza Strip. These strikes, the most extensive since a ceasefire agreement in January 2025, mark a significant escalation in the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas. The roar of fighter jets and the thunder of explosions once again filled the skies over Gaza, a grim reminder of the ever-present threat of violence in the region. The Israel Defense Forces confirmed the strikes. They stated that the targets were terror targets associated with Hamas, the militant group that governs the Gaza Strip. The IDF emphasized its commitment to protecting Israeli civilians from what it describes as incessant terrorist threats. The strikes were not limited to a single area within the densely populated Gaza Strip. The IDF targeted locations across the territory including Rafah, Khan Yunis, Deir al-Balah, Nuseirat, al-Bureij, al-Zaytun, al-Karama, Beit Hanun, and Gaza City. Among the reported targets were residential buildings, raising concerns about civilian casualties. Witnesses described scenes of chaos and destruction. The strikes have left a trail of devastation, adding to the already dire humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the nation shortly after the strikes began. He stated that the strikes were necessary to address the immediate threat posed by Hamas. Netanyahu emphasized that Israel would not tolerate attacks on its citizens or territory. Netanyahu highlighted the issue of hostages held by Hamas. He demanded the immediate and unconditional release of all Israeli hostages, both living and dead. This demand has been a central point of contention between Israel and Hamas. Defense Minister Israel Katz echoed Netanyahu's sentiments. He stated that the strikes were part of a broader strategy to weaken Hamas's military capabilities. Katz stressed that Israel was determined to achieve its war goals, including the return of its citizens and the long-term security of its people. Israel argues that its actions are justified as self-defense against a hostile entity. Hamas, designated as a terrorist organization by Israel, the United States, and other countries, continues to pose a significant security threat. The recent escalation follows the collapse of a ceasefire agreement that had been in place since January 19, 2025. The truce, intended as a temporary measure to de-escalate tensions, ultimately failed to address the underlying issues fueling the conflict. The first phase of the ceasefire expired on March 1, 2025, without a renewal agreement. Talks mediated by Egypt and the United States aim to extend the truce and secure the release of Israeli hostages held by Hamas. The negotiations faltered over key sticking points. Hamas demanded the release of Palestinian prisoners held by Israel, while Israel insisted on the return of its hostages as a precondition for any prisoner exchange. Disagreements over the scope of the ceasefire and the mechanism for monitoring violations further complicated the talks. The United States proposed a plan to extend the ceasefire until mid-April. The proposal included provisions for a phased release of hostages and prisoners, as well as mechanisms for addressing humanitarian concerns in Gaza. However, this initiative ultimately failed to bridge the divide between the two sides. Section 4. Hamas responds. Defiance in the face of overwhelming force. Hamas, in a statement released shortly after the strikes began, vowed to retaliate against what it called Israeli aggression. The group characterized the strikes as a flagrant violation of the ceasefire and international law. Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh addressed the people of Gaza, urging steadfastness and resistance. He accused Israel of deliberately targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. Haniyeh called on the international community to intervene and hold Israel accountable for its actions. Despite the disparity in military capabilities, Hamas maintains a capacity for armed resistance. The group possesses a stockpile of rockets and mortars capable of striking deep into Israeli territory. The potential for a wider conflagration remains a significant concern. Hamas frames the conflict as a struggle for liberation against Israeli occupation. The group enjoys considerable support among Palestinians, particularly in the Gaza Strip, where its social service networks and political infrastructure are deeply entrenched. Section 5. The human cost. Civilian casualties and a humanitarian crisis. The recent escalation of violence has taken a heavy toll on the civilian population of Gaza. The densely populated coastal enclave, home to over 2 million Palestinians, lacks adequate infrastructure and resources to cope with the effects of repeated military operations. The Palestinian Ministry of Health reported a growing number of casualties, including women and children. Hospitals in Gaza, already grappling with chronic shortages of medical supplies and equipment, are struggling to cope with the influx of wounded. The strikes have caused widespread damage to homes, businesses, and essential infrastructure. Power outages, water shortages, and disruptions to communication networks have become commonplace. The United Nations has warned of a potential humanitarian catastrophe if the violence continues. International aid organizations are working to provide emergency assistance to those affected by the fighting. However, access to Gaza remains tightly controlled by Israel, posing significant challenges to the delivery of humanitarian aid.